Well, I put my first coat of bondo on. Very thin coat, just to fill in some roughness. And now I'm sanding it down using about 300 grit sandpaper and this sanding block. Nice long one. The idea is to let the fender tell me what it wants to look like. The high points, this sander will cross them. It'll touch the high points and leave the low points with bondo in them. So essentially what I've got is little pieces of metal showing there, which show the high points, and there's a few little crevices that show low points. So I'm going to work this for a little bit longer, and essentially what you do is you sand and you constantly change the direction so that you're letting the metal tell you what shape it wants to be. Because ultimately, if you put bondo on in thin layers and you sand it like this, the only thing that can happen is you're going to end up with a nice smooth surface. Still haven't quite worked out this bondo here. It needs to be sanded down quite a bit more. Had a little issue with a little bump right here that I didn't notice before. So now I got to go back, smooth that out, see what it looks like underneath that. And thinking maybe I'm going to take out all the paint here because I don't want this fake ridge here. I want it to be nice and smooth so that I can blend it back. Other than that, it's about spending a lot of time with the sandpaper, and then I'm going to put another thin coat of bondo on, go back and do the same thing over again, go back, if I need to do another thin coat, which I probably will, go back and do the same thing. Takes a lot of time, but it's fun. Well, I slapped a second coat of bondo on top of the first coat after I'd sanded it. This coat is a little thicker. Basically I'm going to be taking most of this back off, but I put on a little thicker just to make sure that I don't have to go back and do it again. When I sand it down, I want there to be enough material in the right places. So what I'm doing now, I started down here. Really supposed to do this when it's a little bit softer, but this is cured overnight. Is I take this file, which is actually made for bondo. It's supposed to have some kind of handle on it, but what the heck, I'm an Okie. I don't need it. And what you do is you just file the big, tall, rough spots. You can kind of shape it. There's some area that you put some bondo, and you know, it just saves you a lot of sandpaper if you really don't need bondo there. Like here you can see it's kind of a ridge. So you just take this file and you go over it a little bit. Well, I'll probably put a little more muscle into it, but I'm holding the camera. And just make sure that you don't go into the bondo surface that you want to use as your final surface. You just do that and you knock off the ridges. Here's a kind of a rough edge, and you just file it off. So that's what I'll be doing to that. As soon as it's filed, I'll get the sandpaper. I'll start with 100 grit, and when I get it down to where it's close to perfect, I'll go to about a 300 grit, or maybe a little higher, and maybe end up with about a 500 grit just for the final surface. I've sanded down the second layer of bondo, and then I sprayed with some black spray paint, what's called a guide coat. So over the bondo, and what I'm going to do now is sand one more time very lightly, and wherever the guide coat sands away, those are high spots, and wherever the guide coat stays, those are low spots. So it's going to help me level out the surface. Well, I sanded the guide coat down, and I can see there's some areas that are still dark, and they're going to need to be filled some more. These marks right here, I was getting a little excited with my applicator when I was putting the bondo on, and so I made little marks. So I need to be a little more careful. So I'm going to go back and fill those. Normally you would use a topping, but I'm just going to use bondo. The key here is not to use too much hardener because you don't want it to set up before you can really work it and get it in place. Plus it's a really hot day. You got to use hardener though. If you don't use any hardener, that stuff will never harden. And if you use too much, you'll only have about a minute or two to work with it. I'm going to need to work on this for about 4 or 5 minutes to get all these indentations filled in. So I'm going to mix up a decent sized batch of bondo. Use just a little hardener, mix it thoroughly, consistently. Here's my little mixing, my bondo metal. You can just go ahead and sand that off before you start. That way you don't end up with little crumbs. So everything's nice and clean. Make sure you use a nice clean applicator. Clean off your applicator or get a new one. This is part of an old video store card that I used for this, but yeah, you can use anything that's similar to this. They sell little deals you can pay a couple of bucks for, but you know, why pay money if you can use an old driver's license or something. So I'm going to go ahead and fill it back up, let it set up again, sand it again, and I'm hoping this is the very last layer of bondo. You can see when I sanded it, like that's metal right there. So even though I put on a pretty heavy coat of bondo, there's metal. There's really not much left. I sanded it down. You can see metal poking through right there. And sanded it down so there's really not a very thick coat. The whole idea is to just make a nice smooth surface. So one more layer of bondo, very thin layer just to fill in these little dark areas, and I think we'll be good to go. After we sand that off, go ahead and put on some primer and make it look nice. Well, I've put the third coat of primer on here on this fender, and then I sanded it, got it to where the imperfections are basically the width of a piece of paper. The primer is going to cover that. So the next step is I went ahead and sanded the whole inside and out, roughed up any existing, like this blue up here. It's holding pretty well, so there's no reason to really remove the paint. So just sanded it with 100 grit, and now I'm going to go ahead and paint primer, probably about 3 coats total to build up a good thickness. Then I'll go back with a finer sandpaper and start sanding that primer off to make a paintable finish. Well, I got a couple coats of primer on this fender. Right now it's drying, typically giving it about 15 minutes between coats. I don't want the bottom coat to completely set up before I put the next coat on. That helps the primer adhere to the primer below and bond as if it was the same. So I'm also doing cross brush strokes. Since I'm putting this on with a paintbrush, I'm going ahead and each time I go a different direction when I put another coat on. That helps fill in some of the brush strokes, and it's going to make it easier for me to sand this back down to get it smooth in preparation for paint.